Hey folks, Rep Rab here. I'm excited to be on this panel that's really looking into um, how do we support the growth of a clean energy economy. So first, I want to take a step back and kind of consider the words that we're using here. Um, Clean energy is not as straightforward as it may sound. Well, everybody likes clean, but clean is subject to interpretation. It is a subjective term of art. Some people believe that nukes are clean because they do not emit carbon dioxide. But the reality is the construction of nuclear facilities and dealing with the waste is far from clean or uh, zero carbon. So when I think of green, when I think of clean, I actually think of renewable energy. So I like to be precise with my terminology. So I am invested in um, an infrastructure that prioritizes renewable energy. But then the other part of the question is the economy. And I think it's when we talk about the economy to the exclusion of the much bigger society, of which the economy is just one part, we lose sight on what matters. And I think that what matters is what kind of society we want to live in. And that influences the economy and vice versa. Um, so I think that's an important distinction that should be made, much like we make distinctions between the weather versus the climate. Weather is short term, climate is the weather over a longer period of time, which we can influence by the choices we make through public policy and institutionally. We cannot control the weather. There's also a distinction between energy and power. Sometimes they're used synonymously, and that would be wrong. Um, when we talk about power, it's the amount of energy we use over a certain period of time. And that's an important distinction. And then I think another one is what we mean when we talk about green. Because for green, for some people, it means saving wildlife or saving the whales or baby seals or old growth forests and that sort of thing. And all of those things are important. But there's a diverse audience that climate justice and environmental justice means to different communities. And for folks who are just making it month to month, day to day, they're not so much concerned about polar bears. They're concerned about whether they can go outside and let their kids go outside and play because they have severe asthma, um, or they are living in during a pandemic, as we all are, but whose families have more comorbidities than other people in other neighborhoods, cities, states, countries. And that's important because the reason there's such disparities between demographic groups in this country in terms of comorbidities and the extent to which they are more likely to die or be seriously injured by the exposure to COVID is due to structural inequality as weaponized by um, systemic racism. So all of these things are related. And we are actually living in something um, that's called a syndemic. And a syndemic is basically a confluence of epidemics and pandemics. The syndemic that we are processing now um, includes the COVID pandemic, but it also includes our climate crisis. Thirdly, all the pollution that exists now, all the environmental remediation, um, all of that, that's an epidemic as well. And fourthly, as I mentioned earlier, it's systemic racism. Um, the reason we do not have the type of disparities in more homogenous industrialized nations as relates to COVID is because of the lack of structural inequality born of systemic racism. So the United States is in an awful position beyond just our current administration. It is the history and infrastructure that supports the public policies that make these gaps between the haves and the have-nots, between black and white, worse and worse over generations. So this is the context that we have to discuss um, our future that we hope will be powered by renewable energy. So it's not just that we have our cars running off of electricity. It's more about how do we reimagine a society that has ended its addiction to fossil fuels, and how does it create on ramps to opportunity across the board, not just in terms of um, uh, energy generation, electricity in particular, but also how do we create opportunities that can lead to family sustaining jobs um, and entrepreneurial opportunities for everyone, irrespective of their social, economic, or racial background. And these are conversations that are tough to have because normally we have these conversations in a silo. We talk about it through an environmental lens or an economic lens or from a labor lens. But we have to talk about these issues as they merge together. We have to break down these silos and build bridges. And we cannot have conversations about transforming anything if we don't explicitly reference race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. All of these things are influenced by everything else, and vice versa. So, in my bill to transition Pennsylvania to 100% renewable energy by 2050, it lays out a plan and milestones to get there. And it includes certain triggers and infrastructure, such as commissions and task force to make sure that we're uh, doing what we need to do and hitting those milestones, and preferably uh, uh, beating it to the punch. And one of those things that is important that was tweaked in my reintroduction of the bill in 2018 is just transition. So as we move towards a green future, that society and the opportunities that create it have to be just. And that means social, economic, racial, etc. We have to be intentional about it. We have to be explicit, and we have to have concrete goals, and we have to have compliance there so that if we don't live up to those standards, um, we have something that nudges us in saying, this is what you need to do. Good intentions are not enough. Lofty rhetoric is not enough. We need to be able to measure our progress on all these fronts so that we know how we're doing. That just seems reasonable. Um, Part of the process, too, of moving in the right direction is to make sure that everyone pays their fair share. And so when we look at the biggest polluters, they're large corporations who aren't paying for so much, particularly on state taxes. But also, they're not really responsible for the pollution that goes into the air that we all breathe. And so I'm also proposing carbon pricing, a bill that would put a price on every ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Um, and this would not be at the retail level. This is not for consumers. This is for major producers of the largest amounts of greenhouse gas emissions across the state. And it's significant. And with this fee, um, you don't have to pay it if you're not polluting, but if you are, it's your responsibility to pay your fair share. So if you pollute more than the next guy, then you should pay more. It also encourages folks to embrace better practices to lower their fee profile, so they can either change their ways or leave. This has been a proposal that has been really promoted by conservatives and progressives alike. This has received a lot of national attention. from Reagan era Republicans, and also progressive Democrats, and some folks in between those two on that political spectrum. Why? Because it doesn't pick winners or losers. It doesn't say if you're coal, this, or if you're frack gas, that. It just says if you pollute, you got to pay your fair share. Doesn't matter what the origin of that pollution is. Pollution is pollution, based on how the EIA defines it and how it measures it. So we have all that information. We just don't have the means uh, to make polluters pay. And I'm hoping that in the next legislative term, there'll be a critical mass of legislators on both sides of the aisle who will see the value um, uh, and fiscal, um, uh, I don't want to say conservatism, but I'll say uh, how reasonable this approach is. And it's been done in other countries, Alberta, Canada, um, and elsewhere, and it's building some real momentum. So that's something that that's something I'll be pushing very strongly in the next term. Um, but I think more generally, as we talk about moving towards renewable energy um, and a green society, um, we can't just look at the economy. We have to look at all the different sectors of society and make sure that we focus on equity. Because at the heart of some of the worst decisions we've made on the federal level and on the state level has been where we have not considered equity to be a center point in these public policies. And so we can look at any number of things. When you look at environmental injustice, specifically environmental racism, which has wrought all of these comorbidities we are now dealing with and all paying for emotionally, from a health perspective, financially, everyone, it's born out of environmental racism because the worst polluters, those sites were put in black and brown communities, in or near, or they only allowed black and brown folks to live in the most polluted areas, not just in Philly, not just across the state, but across the country for generations. So it should not be a surprise to anyone that we have such disparate health outcomes based on race in this country. This was systemic, this was intentional, and it was because there was a time, and some would say that it still exists, where Black lives did not matter as much as other lives. And if you don't have proper representation, if your concerns are not being heard, then you're going to be the one stuck with the incinerator and not the new Olympic size public pool. That's one of the things that pushed me into running for office because my grandmother was a community organizer in Baltimore, and they were going to put an incinerator in the colored community while they're going to give a brand new pool to a white community not far away. And that just showed that the city did not care about Black folk. And we were expendable. Our lives were expendable. And we did not have the political, social, or financial capital to raise hell, or so they thought, until they met my grandmother and all the people she organized to make sure that incinerator was not built in their backyard. So all these things are related to justice. And we can't have justice without equity. And equity, at the heart of equity, is fairness. So when we talk about what matters most, we have to think to ourselves, how do these policies impact all of these different communities? Are they different? How much different? Why are they different? And what can we do to reconcile those differences? But even more importantly is, how do we make sure that the right array of stakeholders are at the table before these policies are formalized? Garbage in, garbage out. So if we don't have the right mix of people on the front end, we can't be surprised when folks raise hell when these policies are introduced because they do not give enough deference and understanding of these complex issues as it relates to different communities um, onto which these policies are uh, impacted differently. So those are the things that come to mind when I think about how we move to a society that embraces renewable energy over fossil fuels. I think the other thing, too, that I want to end with is with my 100% renewable energy bill, I have a great number of co sponsors. In fact, it's of the probably over 70 pieces of legislation that I've introduced over 4 years. It's my most popular by far. It's most popular amongst young people, no surprise there. But it has a lot of co sponsors, most of whom are Democrats, some of whom are Republicans. But among my co sponsors, there is an interesting subset who vote in very problematic ways that further the influence and reach of fossil fuels for years to come. And it's very frustrating. And so, one of the things that I need people who are watching panels like this to understand and step up around is how you can collectively make an influence on the people who, on the surface, are supportive of these things, but their voting records and lack of public advocacy on these issues um, is problematic. And so, what I mean by that is we need to make sure that those folks who have co sponsored bills like mine um, are up to date, are knowledgeable about renewable energy and what that transition to 100% renewable energy looks like and how feasible it actually is, particularly with the new administration on the federal level um, and a new majority in the Senate. But generally speaking, what does that look like? Because if they're making really interesting votes that double down on fossil fuel and they support my 100% renewable energy bill, there's something not right there. And what we need to embrace is co governance. And that's the idea that voters and the general public, many of whom are not able to vote because of their age or other reasons, can step up and demand of the folks who they have supported in an election season to say, all right, now I'm going to hold you accountable now that you're in the job or you've been reelected. This is what we want in terms of legislation, public advocacy, um, uh, state funding, et cetera, et cetera. And the job of the engaged citizen is never ending. But the most meaningful work happens between election cycles and not during them. Because a candidate can say whatever they need to say to feel sure that they're going to be reelected or elected. But when they're in the job, how are they going to perform as an incumbent? How are they going to perform as a legislator as it relates to these issues around environmental justice, green energy, etc.? And we have to hold their feet to the fire. That means you need to hold my feet to the fire, but also help me in keeping my colleagues accountable so that they know that just being a co-sponsor to a popular bill is not nearly enough, and that they need to be called out for their problematic votes on other issues that make it harder to pass bills like mine. This is what we can do together, and we have so much momentum. The science, we understand the science. We're on the right side of history. Um, an increasing majority of Americans um, uh, want us to move in this direction. So the wind is to our backs. It's a matter now of how we choose to organize and mobilize and empower ourselves to reimagine and commit to the green energy future we all deserve. Thank you.